Hello artists, I'm DaleneFM and you're watching day 47 of the 365-day epic journey. If you were watching yesterday, you would have seen that I did the colour blocking layer on most of this painting. So it's still very much in its early stages, and while I carry on painting here, you guys can listen to me ramble on about, I think it was paint qualities and transparencies at this stage. So yes, you can listen to me rambling on about those things, and I'm going to carry on painting, and I'll see you afterwards.
There's no going
So you
back.
can do what you wanna do. You already know. You can do what you wanna do.
I'm still going to do the colour blocking here on the purple vest, which I'm going to do now. That's what I'm going to start off with. And then after I've done that, I'm going to go back to the rest of the body and to the background and start refining some of the details. Just so that you know, I was working with a 25-75 mix of medium, a 25% alkyd to 75% terps, as we've discussed before. When I go on to the second layer of the flesh and so on, I will now be using a 50-50 mix. When I'm doing the colour blocking of the shirt, I'll still be using the 25-75. I just want to draw your attention to how very exaggerated the colours are at this stage. As oil painters, it's good for us to paint from dark to light. In other words, starting with your dark colours and lightening up as you go along. It gives your light colours a good ground to work with. Right, now let's get back to paint quality. Now what we were discussing earlier on, the difference in the quality between student quality paints and artist quality paints is the amount of pigment that is involved. Now in the case of Winsor & Newton will tell you that the amount of pigment involved in the Winton range and the amount of pigment involved in the Winsor & Newton range of the same colour is the same amount of pigment, so there's no difference in quality. The reason that you can pay less is because they're providing you with a smaller range that involves only the 1 and 2 series pigments, which are the less expensive pigments. But there are other artists versus student quality ranges that you should stay away from the student quality, because there is an enormous difference between the amount of pigment in the artist range and the amount of pigment in the student range. Remember that the pigment is the most expensive part, so to make the paint cheaper, they reduce the amount of pigment. Now there is a bit of a problem with that, because the less pigment you've got in a tube of paint, the more of that paint you're going to have to use to get good coverage. So it is actually not, it's a little bit penny wise pound foolish. It's not a good idea to buy a student range versus an artist range, because the artist range you can always add oil to thin it down, but you can't do the opposite to the student range. You can't add more pigment to it to bulk it up. It's always a good idea to spend a little bit more money and buy a better quality paint. It will last you longer and it will end up saving you money in the long run. So student paints from that point of view are not a good idea. You do, however, get other ranges of paint that the entire range of paint is nowhere near as good as, say, something like a Winsor & Newton. I'm not going to name brands that I view as negative, because just now I get sued and that's not the point. So I don't want to sit here and tell you that X, Y, Z brands are really not good enough and don't use them. What I will tell you, however, is that Winsor & Newton, with maybe the exception of Lucas in this country, I don't know if Lucas is available in other countries, but Winsor & Newton is by far the best quality of paint that we get here, and Lucas is a good alternative and a good affordable alternative. Another pretty good alternative is the Zelkel range. They have fairly good dense paints. Now, as I said, I don't want to negatively name other paints, but any other paint other than those three, just be careful. That's all I'm going to say. I know there is a paint called Graduate that is put out by Winsor & Newton. I personally have not worked with it, but I believe it's very good. I want to talk a little bit about water-soluble oils. Water-soluble oils are still oil paints. They've been mixed with linseed oil as a carrier, and the linseed oil has been denatured. In other words, it's been broken down on a molecular level so that it can be washed away with water. So don't think that just because it's water-soluble that it's not genuine oil. It is genuine oil. It's just gone through a process. Now I just want to talk a little bit about the transparency of pigments. Some pigments are more transparent than others. Now in the Winsor & Newton or Winton ranges, you'll see on the back of your tube there's a little black square. Some of them are black, some of them just an outline, some of them are a square with the diagonal line, half of it is black and half of it is blank. Now that will talk about the transparency of the paint. A solid black box means that this is a translucent paint. In other words, there's no transparency. Other paints like French ultramarine will have a little block at the back that is empty. That will tell you that that's a highly transparent paint. In other words, if you paint this over another color, the other color underneath will be visible through it. Whereas with this tube of paint, because it's so opaque, the color underneath is going to be blocked entirely. Then you will get others that have got the block halfway colored, which means it's a semi-transparent paint, which means that you will see some of the color underneath, but not completely. Now, why is it different from acrylics? Well, the pigments are the same. In the case of transparent paints, it's the pigment that's transparent, not the paint. It's not the carrier oil, because the carrier oil is the same throughout, whichever pigment you use. The carrier oil is the same. It's either safflower oil or linseed oil, both of which are transparent. It's the pigment itself that is either transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque. But in the case of acrylic colors, whether or not you're using a transparent pigment, it's getting put into a carrier that is only semi-transparent. It's murky at best. So it does affect the transparency. That's why you'll find a lot of artists that concentrate on glazing are going to prefer oil colors, because oils, and I hesitate to say this because a lot of acrylic painters are going to get on my case about it, but it is a pretty commonly accepted fact that oil colors are much more effective at glazing than acrylic colors are, and that is because of the carrier, not the pigment. The carrier with acrylics is the semi-transparent or the murky effect that acrylic paints can have. There's also another thing about pigments that is nice to know, and this is not a quality issue, it's simply the nature of pigments. Some pigments are stronger than others. Now, if you, for example, take something like an alizarin crimson or a viridian green, and you put a little pea-sized ball of white and a tiny spot of alizarin or viridian, and then you next to it you put a little pea-sized ball of white and you put a tiny spot of burnt sienna. Now you mix those two together, your little pea size with the burnt sienna and your little pea size with the viridian or with the alizarin crimson, you're going to find that your viridian or your alizarin has a much stronger effect on the same amount of white, because burnt sienna is a very weak pigment. You need a lot of burnt sienna to make a large difference, as opposed to something like viridian or alizarin crimson or even the ultramarines and French ultramarine, where you only need a small amount to make quite a large difference because it's a very powerful pigment. Now that is the pigment itself. It's not the quality of the paint that will give you that. It is the pigment itself. Please understand that the quality of paint is the amount of pigment to carrier oil. Now it is true that poorer quality man-made pigments can come into play. Now, like I was saying earlier on, pigments can come from various sources. And in more modern times, we have found a way to recreate some of the pigments that are available. And it's a good idea in the case of some of the cadmiums, for example, because cadmiums are actually relatively toxic to us, not to the environment. So it is actually a pretty good idea that synthetic paints are made to replace some of the more toxic paints. So the paints that are from a synthetic origin, in other words, the man-made colors, the man-made pigments, you'll be able to recognize on your tube of paint because it has the word hue on it. So in the case of cadmium yellow hue, you know that this is not a genuine cadmium yellow, it's a cadmium yellow look-alike. It's been made to look like cadmium yellow. And the modern day look-alikes are, there's no difference. You cannot tell the difference between a cadmium yellow and a cadmium yellow hue, unless, I suppose, you're looking under a microscope at a molecular level and you're a paint restorer or a historian. You probably wouldn't know the difference. It behaves in exactly the same way. So what I want to say in wrap up is, you know, us as artists, we can learn as much as we like about the actual painting process, how to draw this, how to paint that, how to create this, and that's all good and well. But we also need to know what is actually going on inside our tube of paint. It's a little bit pointless in the long run for us to spend a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to get the education on how to do something, and then we use poorer quality products, poor brushes, poor paints, poor canvases, and we're not giving our paintings the best chance of longevity. I have heard it said by a lot of contemporary artists that I rub shoulders with, you know, my paintings are not going to be around in 100 years' time, you know, I'm not the next Van Gogh or I'm not Picasso. Well, first of all, you never know. You never know. You never know who's going to buy your painting and how they're going to value it. And if you're going to charge money for your paintings, you've got to put your best foot forward, and that includes the best products that you can afford. It really isn't worth spending a small amount of money for short-term gain and your painting doesn't have the long-term benefit of a good quality paint. In my opinion, you should rather spend more per tube of paint and buy less paint. Don't buy a huge amount of paint. Rather spend more and get a better quality paint and mix the colors that just, you know, if you buy your, I've spoken about it before, if you buy your basic colors, you buy the colors that are out of gamut, that you can't mix, like your burnt siennas, alizarin crimson, the transparent paints particularly, or the dioxazine purple that is outside of gamut, magenta. Those colors are outside of gamut. You can't make them, and if you can make them, you can't make them transparent. But paintings that are in gamut, and by gamut I mean the paintings that you can create by using your red, blue and yellow, your color wheel. Any paints that you can use, that you can make using those three, rather do that. Rather buy an expensive small range of paints than buy cheaper large range of paints. It really, really will be worth it in the long run. You're going to give your painting the best chance of longevity. We're also going to need to talk about the qualities of canvases at some stage in the future. Now that's not terribly critical because the canvases that we buy in art shops these days are brilliant. They are lovely and you don't have to worry about them. We don't make our own canvases anymore so much. Although at some stage I love making my own paints. And right next to me I've got an enormous big roll of canvas because I really enjoy making my own canvases. So we're going to do a course on that, a talk on that just for the sheer fun of it. But canvas quality is important, and as long as you make sure that you're buying the right canvas quality from your art shop, you should be fine. But the quality of your paints is what's really going to make or break the longevity of your painting. So that is really important to understand what is in your tube of paint and how that's going to affect the light fastness, the color fastness, and the longevity of your work for generations to come. Because somebody, somewhere along the line, even if it's just your children and their children and their children, somebody's going to value your painting for a long time to come. Well, artists, thank you for joining me on day 47. I hope you enjoyed it, and please don't forget to like and share, and I will see you tomorrow in day 48. Bye.
That's what you want to do.